In the 80s and 90s, Peru was in the midst of a conflict between the ruling right wing government and two armed insurgent groups, the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA. Many civilians paid a very high price in the conflict, including targeted attacks on LGBTQ plus communities. The government would point fingers at Shining Path and MRTA for attacks on LGBTQ plus groups, which did in fact kill a large number in targeted attacks. When the government committed those same attacks, they would blame it on gay elements attempting to diminish the credibility of the government. It would take some 20 years after the conflict ended that the true scope of the impact on the community and their families would be fully understood. In Lima alone, 10 significant hate crimes affected 500 people. One of the most serious happened in 1989 in Tarapat when 6 members of the MRTA captured 8 gay men and trans people, executing them in the Las Gardenias bar. There were similar attacks in Wanui, Pucallpa, Tingo Maria, and Acayuca. More than 30 years later, the events remain painful ones. From the perspective of the Shining Path and MRTA groups, these attacks were referred to as crusades against vice. Sickeningly, local populations sometimes celebrated these attacks, and some even requested and encouraged them. Often the bodies would not be claimed by relatives, and no one would request investigation or punishment for the crimes. With the conflict over, the government would try to establish an official history of the whole thing. In that history, what happened to the LGBTQ plus community, who did it to them, and how, were all hidden, although a few incidents were mentioned briefly in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Commission's objective was not to investigate or thoroughly document these targeted crimes. Even during the reconciliation process, families of those who were killed were denied the right to have their stories told as part of the process. They were told repeatedly that their lives were so insignificant that the absence of their lives were not worth talking about. The LGBTQ plus were not the only community treated this way, and many indigenous families were also dismissed. The story of the 8 people at Las Gardenias, Cesar Marcelino Carvajal, Max Perez Velasquez, Luis Mogollon, Alberto Chong Rojas, Rafael Gonzalez, Carlos Piedra, Raul Shumbe Rodriguez, and Yoni Achue were only added to the final report when community organizations pushed in the final month to have them added. It was not until local organizations began pushing for a record and creating one for themselves that the stories of what happened finally hit the light of day. They told of 4 men that were slaughtered and displayed in public with terroristic signs left on their bodies. The story of 10 homosexuals and sex workers slaughtered in Acayucu was told, and how a month later another group was lined up at La Joyada and machine gunned down. The story of how the Shining Path imposed strict anti-LGBTQ plus rules on communities within their control, how more were persecuted and more died. They would tell how 12 young people were kidnapped in Pikuriaku and how 3 of them were murdered. The other 9 forced to witness the murders and then released to warn others. They told of being dragged up hills only to face mutilation and death, rape and torture. And they told how none of this was the exclusive crime of the terroristic groups, but also of the military, who disappeared 57 people in one night in Ponta. For some that lived, there were the beatings, the rapes, and the extortion. More than one had to pay fees to the MRTA so that they would not kill them. As long as the fees were paid, they were allowed to live, or at least until the next whim of the armed forces or other terrorist groups. Thousands of victims did not make it to the official history, and that's changing slowly. They would choose May 31st and declare the National Day fight violence and hate crimes against lesbians, trans, gays, and bisexuals. Even 30 years on, though, the history remains disputed, dismissed, and minimized by many. There's a memorial to the victims of the conflict in a large park in Lima. There is a stone there for each of the victims with their names inscribed on it, and it took 15 years for the names of LGBTQ plus individuals to be added. Even in 2019, though, the names would, for many, be their dead names and not the name they chose for themselves, still denying their identity. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying these videos and you want to see more, please click the subscribe button and hit those notifications so that you don't miss any uploads. We appreciate you. Thanks.